please welcome to the stage Director of Grants and Programs at the Florida Blue Foundation, Velma Montero Tribble.
And good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for coming back to listen in and participate in this incredible discussion that will happen shortly. The title, as you know, is LGBTQ and Racial Equity, and the tagline, Two Sides of the Same Coin. And to lead this great discussion this afternoon, we have Nadine Smith, who is co-founder and CEO of Equality Florida. And you have their resumes in detail on the app, so I'm only going to talk about a few things about them because we'd be here all afternoon if I talked about the two of them and their resume. But she is in charge of Equality Florida, the state's largest organization that's dedicated to ending discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. She's an award-winning journalist. She's a journalist that turned into an organizer. She was the first lesbian group of women that were gay and lesbian women that were invited by the then President Clinton to sit in on a meeting to talk to him about the issues. She was also on the then President Obama's National Finance Committee, and the list goes on the things that she's accomplished in her short lifetime. The next person is Skye Pierman, and she is President and CEO of Democracy Forward. Skye is, as I said, is President and CEO of Democracy Forward, a national legal organization that advanced democracy and social progress through litigation, policy engagement, and regulatory advocacy. She's developed and led groundbreaking legal and policy strategies which was most recent, I think, dealt with Medicaid, which really benefit millions and millions of postpartum women in the U.S. She is also noted and cited in her legal work by the U.S. Supreme Court. Can you believe that? Was one of our judges there when you did that? She is also an incredible person that's noted through the New York Times, National Public Radio, and NBC News. With those accolades, I now ask these two ladies to join me on the stage, and Nadine, come to the podium.
I had a real life-changing event happen in Miami in 2014. It was the last gathering of this thing called Leadership Florida, which you may have leadership, whatever state you're from, but it's mostly a gathering of business people and politicos, and then they let a few nonprofits in the door as well. And so this was our last meeting, and it was May 2014. And I remember that because while Donald Trump's campaign for presidency was, in those early days when everybody knew he was going to run, it was when it was still a punchline. It was when it was not seen at all as inevitable. And I remember we had a speaker from North Carolina, Dr. James Johnson, and he was going to give a speech that was something like the demographic consumer indexes, and anyway, I can't remember, it sounded boring. I was going to position myself in the back of the room and play Words with Friends. And then he stepped forward and he said, America is in the midst of a demographic convulsion that is about to roil every aspect of our society, politically, economically, and socially. He said the collision was between the graying of America and the browning of America. And the graying of America because economic inequities become healthcare inequities. White people live longer. So the graying of America was disproportionately white and disproportionately voting and disproportionately held levers of economic and political power. And the browning of America reflected the reality that by 2050 there would be no racialized majority. It would be truly a salad, a melting pot, whatever metaphor. And he said, and that second reality has created an existential panic among the first. And he said, the reason I'm bringing this up is if you're looking at the things as they unfold on the world stage, they may not make sense unless you understand what drives that anxiety. The sense of a country changing, a sense that this isn't just a demographic shift that's happening in cities, that it's happening all across in the small places in America, the small towns in America. Now, I grew up in the panhandle of Florida. And I remember I was on the basketball team, I was on the softball team. I'm not trying to be a total lesbian stereotype, but I do remember when the bus would come rolling through a place called Southport. I remember being told by a coach, all the black kids being told to slide down on our seat because they might shoot through the window if they saw a black face. And it wasn't delivered in any really dramatic way. It was just sort of, common sense. You wear your seatbelt, you duck your head when you drive through Southport if you're beautifully melanated. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the fact that now if you go to Southport, you will see interracial couples, you'll see bodegas, you will have to go through Southport because that's the path to the airport. And how much my hometown, which was very segregated. In the middle of my town, there was a place that was called 100 Acres of Modern Home for Colored People. When I graduated high school in 1983, it was still there. When I graduated college in 1987, that sign was still there. And it wasn't until my father and a group of black business men bought that land, that sign finally came down. So I have thought almost daily, if you were following me on Facebook, you would know exactly the day that I heard Dr. Johnson speak, because everything I posted took a decidedly more sinister tone, like my expectations of where the country was heading shifted. It made sense now why people didn't simply react badly to Barack Obama's presidency, that they went after his actual citizenship, the birther scandal, the idea of who gets to define what an American truly is. And now, those little seeds that were sort of planted in my consciousness, you don't have to be particularly insightful to follow these threads because they have become part of the narrative. It's part of the Fox, you can tune into Fox News and hear about replacement theory. You can see the driver of white birth rates versus black and brown birth rates driving so much of what is happening politically, from the overturn of Roe v. Wade to the legislation that we are seeing popping up across the country. The Stop Woke Act here in Florida that goes into schools and into private companies and says, you can't teach honesty, an honest history of America. You can't talk about racism, and you can't talk about the continuing legacy and ongoing racial structures in America, because doing so makes people uncomfortable. It undergirds the Don't Say Gay, Don't Say Trans, Don't Say LGBT bill, also that was passed this last legislative session. And people might debate what the intention was. I don't have to debate it because I got to hear all the arguments, and they boil down to this. A lot of gay kids, a lot of LGBT kids, much more than when I was in high school, says Senator Old Person, and I don't like it. And so I want schools to be less hospitable to the existence of LGBT people. And they were pretty direct about it during the legislative session. They didn't hold back, they didn't pretend it was about other things. But after session, when public opinion was not tilting in their favor, they began to say, oh no, it's not about that. It's not about erasing LGBT people, LGBT kids, LGBT parents. It's about not having inappropriate sexual conversations with kids, not introducing them to these complicated conversations before they're ready, and that's a parent's job. Now, as a parent of an 11-year-old, if somebody said, hey, they're having really inappropriate sexual conversations at school, and discussing topics that you as a parent should be the one to have, I would be going, yeah, that sounds terrible. Let me know more about that. And so I think there are some people who didn't step forward in the same, with the same animosity and the same desire to erase LGBT young people that animated the legislative session and is the political driver for these kinds of, this kind of legislation. But here's the facts. What we are seeing now, even before July 1st, when the bill comes into effect, we are seeing books being taken off the shelf because they are written by Black authors discussing racism. We are seeing books removed from shelves because they include LGBT characters. We are seeing challenges. They've even challenged the book And Tango Makes Three, which is the true story of two penguins raising an adopted penguin chick. And they're challenging it because the two penguins are male. They have challenged Mama, Mommy, and Me, my two dads. They even rejected 41% of the math books proposed for the state of Florida, saying they were riddled with critical race theory. And only after reporters dug and dug did they reveal that in one instance, it was rejected because one of the hidden figures from the movie Hidden Figures was mentioned in a math book about the critical role that she had played, and it noted that she was the first Black woman to be hired in such a position at NASA. And their reaction was, why are we talking about her race? Why are we making people uncomfortable by talking about her race? It is not the first time that we have seen renewed attacks on the LGBT community moving hand in hand with attacks on honest conversations about racism in America. In fact, in Florida in the 50s and 60s, there was something called the Johns Committee. It was a committee of the Florida legislature that existed for two reasons: to eliminate from the education system Black civil rights advocates and homosexuals. And they would go into schools. I was friends with a woman who was the target of one of those investigations. She was going to the University of Miami. She had fallen in love for the first time, and the last thing on her mind was a state legislature-driven investigation. And so she wasn't doing much to cover her tracks, even in those days. And she and her girlfriend got called in by investigators. Her girlfriend cracked immediately, and she held on to the lie that it was not true. Nothing she said was true. They started the interview by taking the newspaper from her hometown and setting it on the table in front of her, a hometown where her family was fairly prominent. And they said the headline will be, "Pervert Expelled from University," if she didn't give up names. And she kept lying and kept lying and kept lying. And eventually they agreed not to kick her out, but that she had to go on dates with men, and she had to keep a journal describing those dates, that she had to surrender at any time to a government agent to inspect for credibility. There was lots of blackmail, lots of sexual assault that went on under the guise of the Johns Committee. A lot of people's careers were ended. A lot of people lost their livelihoods, and some people took their own lives to escape the torment of the Johns Committee. And then you move to the 70s, and Anita Bryant. And Anita Bryant ran a campaign called Save Our Children. And it played on these same tropes that we're hearing today, the implication that there's something so sinister about the existence of LGBT people that our very existence poses a threat to children. And she ran a campaign that, in its wake, banned adoption in the state of Florida, put the marriage ban into state law, caused the repeal of the Miami-Dade Human Rights Ordinance, and would block the passage of human rights ordinances across the state for decades. And that campaign marched across the country all the way to California before it was stopped. And that message, Save Our Children, did extraordinary damage, extraordinary harm. And I remember Anita Bryant quite vividly as a young kid growing up in Florida. There was no Gay-Straight Alliance, there was no GSA, there was the one teacher in my high school that was rumored to be gay stayed as far away from students as possible. The one teacher in my junior high school who was rumored to be gay committed suicide, and she was a punchline. Anita Bryant was financially supported by a group called the Moral Majority, and at that time, they weren't talking about abortion. The big thing that was animating their organizing was a Supreme Court decision that paved the way for integrating private schools, not just public schools. That was the thing they were most upset about. It's important to understand our history, to understand how we get to this place. How we get to this place when people have anxiety about the changing demographics of America. Because if you think of America as a nation of immigrants, stolen land, built on the stolen labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants, that is moving gradually, slowly, but steadily towards the realization of the promises first made only to landowning white men, but expanding systematically to include more. The shifting demographics of America don't create a panic in you. You see America as inclusive of all of us, all of our experiences. But if you see America primarily as a white nation, a Christian nation, male-led, then you will see the demographic shift in our country as perilous, as threatening, as ominous. And even if you don't like everything that the leaders speak or insinuate or do or say, as long as they are comforting you that power and place isn't slipping away, you can look the other way and still support them. And so we are at that crossroads in America again about what our country will be. And what we see when these episodes erupt, and this one I would argue is more dangerous because it is about whether or not our democracy will hold. And imperfect as it has been, so much of the progress we have made has been because we have been able to make either change at the ballot box or stop the hemorrhaging at the ballot box, so that the work we do at the community level, at the grassroots level, community by community, has the oxygen to take hold. But right now, we are in a perilous place, either because it is the last gasp of a fearful dinosaur lashing out, or it's the re-entrenchment of the worst parts of our history. A willingness to erase, to marginalize, to cause harm to those that you do not want to accept as fundamentally belonging to this nation as much as you do. So the crossroads is, which direction will we go? And the implications for our health and safety are profound. Before the introduction of bills that targeted trans kids and their parents and said, you don't get to make choices about your health, we do. We, in Florida, saw the Youth Risk Behavior Survey improving. We saw the numbers getting better for LGBTQ young people. After the session before this past one and this past one, we are seeing those numbers get worse very rapidly, even when you factor in COVID compared to non-LGBTQ peers. So how does the state respond to this? They're opting out of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. They will simply stop measuring the thing that tells on them. We saw that same attitude around COVID. We'll just get rid of the data rather than be accountable to what the data shows. And so, as funders, I want to say this. The healthcare disparities emerge from a range of things. And to address healthcare disparities, you have to go further up the pipeline. You have to look at why LGBTQ young people make up 30% of homeless youth. You have to ask yourself why the school-to-prison pipeline is disproportionately LGBTQ young people of color. You have to ask why young people aren't feeling safe enough in school to stay in school, why depression and self-medication are happening. And right now, we have a Safe and Healthy Schools program, and we hear from parents and students and teachers daily talking about how much harder their job got because the governor wants to be president and he is shaping his campaign on the backs of LGBTQ young people. But LGBTQ young people are the reason that I have hope, because they are being pushed backwards to a world they never occupied. I know what it was to grow up in a hostile place with no familial support, with no resource, to feel alone and wonder if being alive was worth it. I did not see myself on television. There was nobody to come out to. And when I would secretly look up books that had any gay content whatsoever, I would trick a classmate into checking them out because I did not want my name to be on that little card that you slid into the back of the book. Some of y'all are old enough to remember that. But what gives me hope is young people, because they're not willing to go back to a place that was not their past. And when students poured out of the classroom and held walkouts during the legislative session, they organized themselves to do that. They organized themselves to get to Tallahassee. And when the bill passed, they went back to their campuses and started registering voters. I think they have miscalculated the place we are in America. I believe that we will prevail. I think most people believe in the golden rule. I think most people believe that our futures are tied. The question is how much harm and damage will be inflicted by that collision of the graying of America and the browning of America. And you all in this room, I hope that you will be as bold in fighting back, not just at the effect, but at the cause of these inequities, defending democracy, and standing up, especially when elected leaders are very specifically going to corporations and saying, I dare you to speak up. I dare you to challenge my culture war. And I'm sure there are people in this room who are wondering, how do I navigate the politics of my donors, of the political environment that I'm in, to show up in ways that matter? We have to at least have the courage of a 9th grader willing to stand up and walk out of class. We have to at least have the courage of those who are bearing the brunt of these attacks. So I thank you for inviting me here, and I hope that in being in Florida, you will take a moment to write a letter, send a note to our governor, and let him know on a very personal level that what he is doing is not just politics. It is harm. He's inflicting harm on people. And we notice, because he is not just a Florida challenge. He seeks to be president, and he seeks to export this agenda to every single state. And it is important. The one thing we've learned about bullies and doing anti-bullying work, if they learn that they can push you, they will not stop. This is the moment, that gut check moment, when you find out whether your values that you have stated are real or whether they are marketing materials. And I have faith that we will get to the other side of it, but how you show up will tell us how quickly we get to the other side of it and how much damage will be done between now and then. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. Being with you here today is an honor and also a responsibility. We all need to be doing what we can to support you and your work and organizations like yours that are on the front lines of hostile legislatures and that are producing an onslaught of discriminatory bills and statutes that undermine our public health and our communities. For those of you that don't know me, and I don't know many of you, my name is Skye Perryman, and I'm the president and CEO of an organization called Democracy Forward, and we bring the power of people and communities from cross-sections of American lives into the courts and into the regulatory process and into the legal processes in other ways. But I got to tell you, there aren't any elephants in this room. For those of us that do work in the courts, these are incredibly dark times. And for those committed to democracy, like you in this room, these are incredibly dark times. And for people in Florida, for people in my home state of Texas, these are great times. For people that like forward movement in general, these are hard. And also for those, like many of you, that believe in science and data and evidence, this is hard times. And so I don't need to tell you that, but I am going to, following Nadine, talk a bit about some of our work and the relationship that we've seen between these things. And I will promise you that, like Nadine, I also have hope, and it's because of people in this room. We know, and history teaches us, that when people use their privilege and power to stand up and make change and fight back, that we can fight back. And we know and have been in situations where the court has ingrained and entrenched dehumanized narratives about people in our legal system, and we have overcome that. And part of that was philanthropy working and being along in the fight. And so I'll mention a bit about that. But I'll say that my work at Democracy Forward started in the aftermath of the 2016 election, when, because of the factors Nadine talked about, we knew that the attacks on LGBTQ rights, on women's rights, on science, on data, on evidence, we knew that they were going to become more entrenched, because there's these sort of forces that want us to go backwards, that have always been part of American society, were given an outsized amount of political power at that time. And it was clear from the early days that the new era that we were in was not going to be just about policy disagreements, that maybe people that have different ideas on tax policy or different ideas, it wasn't just going to be about those policy disagreements, but it was going to be about facts and science and evidence. In 2016 and 2017, we saw disputes over the popular vote count. This was before the 2020 election. We saw that the president was upset that he didn't win the popular vote, and so he established a commission to collect individualized data, personal data on American voters through the Department of Homeland Security and others, in order to intimidate communities of color and to intimidate immigrant communities and not use the process. We and others challenged that. And ultimately, in the face of that challenge, the bully did have to back down there, and the commission was disbanded. And I just, as we think about January 6th and all the terrifying things that we've seen in the last few months, we can imagine what that would have been had someone not stood up and a group of organizations not stood up against long odds to challenge what was going on. And I wanted to give a few examples of the types of things that we saw in that time, because they're precursors to the types of bills that we're seeing in Florida and Texas and elsewhere. And they didn't really always make the front headlines of the news because there were so many other terrifying things going on at the time. In 2017, the prior administration attempted to stop collecting data on wages by race and by gender in order to prevent the collection of information about the inequities between wages, between men and women, between white people and black people and brown people. We challenged those in court and won, but imagine what would have happened had they not been challenged. And at the time, people thought that that was a hard case, that it was not a viable case, that you couldn't do that because the government has a lot of discretion in what it is able to collect. We saw efforts to strike data collection and erase LGBTQ people from the 2020 census. We saw states like Alabama try to erase immigrants from their count. In 2020, the prior administration announced that it would eliminate data collection requirements that were intended to aid Indigenous people and LGBTQ foster youth and families. And in so doing, they upset a rule and a regulation that had had strong, broad support in 2016. We challenged that in court, and that remains pending. And these are just some of examples of what we saw as a precursor to now what we're seeing in the state and local governments. And yes, they are two sides of the same coin. And what we have learned then, and what we've seen in various times throughout our country's history, is that people and institutions who abuse their power do so in ways that seek to undermine foundations like democracy, like the courts, like science, evidence, and data, and that they're all related. And that the attack on evidence-based policies and data collection, of course, haven't stopped. And Nadine talked about that, what we're seeing in Florida. I will give you a few other examples. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, when states like New York and other states sought to prioritize health equity measures in the treatment of COVID-19, we saw efforts from extreme right-leaning legal organizations to bully health departments, to send demand letters to health departments to have them back off of the racial equity considerations. 2 cases were filed in New York challenging New York City and New York State racial equity measures with claims of, quote, reverse racism. This became incredibly politicized, and you saw former President Trump speak about it on the stump in Arizona and in other states. And although those cases were dismissed, the damage has been done in many ways because of health departments throughout the country that are concerned about taking these efforts and what happens. And I will say that we led, and many of you have supported organizations, we led a coalition of 20 public health organizations and medical organizations from all types of American life and scholars to file briefs in the cases where they were challenged to make it clear that this is just fundamentally wrong, the allegations that were being put forward in those cases and that were being talked about on the nightly news and part of this entire thing. And of course, we know that this is a playbook that we've seen before. You all know in 2012, there were documents released that various organizations were seeking to drive a wedge between communities of color and LGBTQ communities in order to try to stave off movement on equal marriage and on civil rights. In the context of book banning, and Nadine mentioned this in Florida, we're seeing it across the country. They're not just banning any books. They're banning books about American history, about seeking to erase LGBTQ people, racial history, and the realities of American life. And we also see parallel efforts inside of schools to push back on diversity and inclusion efforts in order to intimidate, just like intimidating health departments, intimidating small school boards and parent groups away from building a more inclusive future. And so all this is to say that what's happening in state houses, in school boards, in the courts, in the regulatory agencies, these are places where people in this room need to be. And in many ways, they're on the front lines not only of protecting evidence-based data and accurate information about our health, about our history, about health outcomes, but they're also on the front lines of protecting our democracy. And so that was a bit of a doom scroll, but we're not on Twitter. That was a bit of a doom scroll, and I told you I wouldn't just do that. And so I'll tell you, the courts really are a very bleak place to be right now, as are many of the legislatures, because of the outsized influence that a far-right contingent has right now over our political processes. But we have been in similar places, maybe not the same places, but we have been in similar places before, and philanthropy has had a key role in being part of turning the tide. At the turn of the 20th century, in the 1900s, the Supreme Court was overturning a number of policies that were seeking to protect workers, that were seeking to protect families and communities. I mean, policies that said that you couldn't require bakers to stand on their feet for more than 60 hours a week in bad working conditions and crowded working conditions. The Supreme Court struck those down time and time again. And at that point, there were legal organizations and others that were founded in order to use the law in new ways to fight back, and philanthropy was part of that. People talk about how hard it's going to be to win arguments in the court right now. Think about the people that were building the cases for cases like Brown v. Board and their predecessors. We know that philanthropy had a critical role in that movement. Indeed, in Brown v. Board would have never made it to the Supreme Court without the financial support of community foundations who helped pay filing fees and expert costs, who helped when things were dismissed to be able to keep cases going. This is not time for the faint of heart when, because challenges are happening, we don't get in. It's exactly the time where we've seen philanthropy be able to help empower. In fact, the very studies that formed the basis of the court's decision in Brown versus Board were funded by philanthropic institutions that put money into showing that the problems of racial inequity were structured by white privilege, and that was a problem for education of all children in America and in courtrooms. Most recently, the fight for LGBTQ rights and equal marriage, the Bostock decision, we saw a broad social movement where philanthropy had a real role to play in keeping those fights going when the going gets tough. And so it is an honor to be here today. I can't wait for us to be able to take your questions. I know you're celebrating 40 years. You've been through a lot of tough times. I think the next 40 years may be more difficult. But I know that I believe, and Nadine believes, and we all believe that democracy is worth the fight, and that this is about a long game, and it's about work now to get off the sidelines and into this fight that we all need to be asking. And I'll just say, you know, we can't afford to perpetuate the notion that these are lost causes, that legislatures are lost causes, or that the courts are lost causes. We saw Friday that the courts themselves may not be a last resort defense right now, some of the courts. They may not be a last resort defense. They're instead a front line of the battle for democracy and of the battle for the equality of people and the equal dignity of people. And that drives so much of what you've supported and what we're grateful for you to support. And it can drive our future if we propel forward together. So thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions and all of the work that you'll do to help us move things forward in this critical time.
We thank our great speakers, Nadine and Sky. Now we will open it up to you to ask questions. There's a microphone there. If you can't make it to a mic, raise your hand. There will be staff that will bring a mic to you. So now is your chance to engage with the speakers.
Hi, my name is Lisa Madry. I'm with the Episcopal Health Foundation in Houston, Texas. And in my volunteer time, I'm also on the Board of Governors with the Human Rights Campaign and do a lot of volunteer work on LGBTQ issues in our community. And so on a couple of levels, well, first of all, thank you, especially Nadine, for the work that you've been doing in Florida. And I know having to listen to that testimony is very traumatizing to experience, and I just appreciate that yourself being willing to put yourself in the breach there. So my question is for both of you around my own feeling about, you talked about DeSantis running for president, and I was talking to a state legislator in Texas about what arguments, who could we talk to, who could influence the governor on Medicaid expansion, and he said, well, if you could get Ron DeSantis to do it, then maybe Governor Abbott would do it. And so that dynamic that's playing out, that's a national strategy, but it's playing out locally and state by state. I'm kind of wondering what you see. My own feeling is that we need national strategies and we need hyper-local strategies. Like for the legislators to finally push back, people in their own communities are going to have to come to them and say, we need Medicaid expansion. We can't attract trans kids. They live in our community. Like the same forces. We need both national and hyper-local strategies, and I'm wondering if y'all have thoughts about where you've seen that work, where you've seen legislators stand up, for instance, to DeSantis or to their pressures to come on board with policies that really aren't in their interests.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm going to answer the question as best I can. We know that this legislation did not emerge from actual things happening in the states. They're crafted by conservative think tanks, and they're intended to be wedge issues, as you mentioned, right? And so, it's like raise your hand if you know a third grader, a transgender third grader playing soccer. Like, probably nobody's hand is going to go up, right? In the state of Florida, over a decade, there were 10 athletes in the state who accessed through the existing guidelines. But what they know is that this is an issue that, because of that lack of familiarity, and because it can play on fears of change and difference, it has become part of a political strategy. I have spent a lot of time talking to other states saying, think of Florida as a warning, but not as a roadmap, because we have a very specific set of facts on the ground here. We have had decades of Republican control at every level. And it used to be that there were moderates within the Republican Party that were sort of an emergency brake to the worst excesses. But I think part of what Trumpism brought was fealty to the person over the principle. Like, in fact, the way that you showed your loyalty was, to put that loyalty above principles that you might have espoused. So we can say things about your wife, it doesn't matter. And so how that played out in Florida was a lot of good Republicans left or got primaried or capitulated. And it wasn't sufficient for them simply to capitulate. One Republican who voted against the Don't Say, there were 9 Republicans that voted against the Don't Say Gay bill. Most of them worked very closely with children and tried to alter the worst aspects of it. And when they weren't successful, they couldn't vote for it. One of them who voted against it after listening to an impassioned plea from her Democratic colleague who was an out gay man, her punishment was she was compelled to introduce the bill going after Disney. So, I mean, it's Shakespearean in its, you know, the power play here. You know, the brutality is the point. Not every state is dealing with that. These bills have been shot down in some other states because they don't have the exact same dynamics of 20 years of control, of installing conservative judges. They don't have the same dynamic of a governor who wants to be president. And so there are places where this has been shot down, and there have been Republican governors. The Utah governor who vetoed the sports ban, tears in his eyes after meeting with parents and parents of trans kids and the kids themselves, where he said, I have never seen so much hatred directed towards such a small group of Americans before. And it touched his heart. Now, he was overridden by the legislature, but he was not alone. There have been episodes of bipartisan opposition to all of this. But I think when I say it's a gut check moment, we're starting to see companies that kind of got very quiet during the Stop Woke bill and the Don't Say LGBT bills, who are now very publicly saying, if you need access to health care, whether it's abortion or gender affirming care, we will cover the cost of getting you where you need to go. You've got the United States military saying, if service members, if your families are not safe in these places where these laws are being passed, we will relocate you. So I think that there comes a moment when it is not easy that you have to say, I'm going to speak into the silence and walk the talk. And that's the moment that we are calling on. In some states, that's going to begin to turn the tide. Florida is uniquely situated where it makes it harder, but not impossible. But it's, somebody said America is waking up to what Germans came to understand, that 1/3 of the country remained silent while 1/3 attacked the final third. And that's the dynamic that is most dangerous in this moment right now.
And I'll just say a few things on that. I mean, I think it's one thing, what we know about folks that wield an outsized influence of power is that sort of in order to keep it, they have to try to convince people that they have more of it than they really should if everybody stood up. And so what we saw in places like Missouri on Medicaid expansion, now Texas is different because we don't have in Texas citizen-led ballot initiatives. But in Missouri, when the legislature didn't do the work of the people, a ballot initiative took Missouri into extending Medicaid. And so I think that there are various interventions, and one of the worst things we can do, and that our media can do, and that people in this room can do, is sort of believe these last chapters have been written and that we're just sort of doomed for this, because I think that there are things. So what I wanted to comment on was your question around a national strategy and hyper-local strategies, because we have seen this, and this is one place where, as Nadine was saying, and much of these bills or even legal movements, these demand letters, they are crafted by a small number of people who have been well-funded and coordinated. And then they take those and, into cities and counties and localities and states throughout the country. And so what we know is that most of these movements are not organic movements. And we've seen this. We're about to release some documents. We have some on the sanctuary cities for the unborn that are all over. This was not an organic movement. This was like two people that had a lot of resources that went into communities to do this work, to then make it look like there's this rising tide in an organic movement. And so part of it really is being able to find those ways, understanding what the national landscape is, and we do a lot of that work now to try to really monitor what's going on so that you can say, okay, this is a national thing, here are some ways we can get support to folks on the ground, and then hyper-local strategies too. And it can work. It is hard you know, Nadine says it's hard in places like Florida, it's hard in places like Texas because they're similar with that, but it's not, I don't think it's impossible. And in many places where I think these movements would like you to believe, they have a lot more support than they actually do. I mean, that's what happened in New York with the COVID guidance. They were able to intimidate people. There was no brief on behalf of large institutions filed. They were sort of worried about reverse racism. The entire mainstream health, medical community, I mean, we were able to bring them together on a brief, and so part of it's really pushing up against that and pushing up against that door.
I think there's a question in the back.
Hi, my name is Marty Pack. I'm with Whale of a Tale Productions. I'd just like to say, my child is transgender, and I worry about him all the time, every day. Sorry. And we live in Ohio. They've chosen to move to a more friendly state. And I'd like you to maybe address a little bit about the white nationalist movement leaving Trump and now attacking transgender people. Thank you.
Do you want to take it first? All right, I'll go. First of all, I understand your fears. I understand I talk to parents, some parents who are moving out of the state of Florida because of the moves that the governor has made that endanger the safety of their children. Cutting off access to Medicaid-funded treatment isn't simply an inconvenience. It can be a matter of life and death. And so it is a scary time. We are seeing upticks in anti-LGBT violence. We certainly are seeing the horrors unfolding when it comes to people who have embraced this replacement theory, who've embraced these hateful stereotypes. We hear replacement theory and groomer being used by the people who are launching attacks. And so it's scary. It's a scary time, and it has a very direct impact on young people. I think that in terms of a national strategy, the person who had the question ahead of you, it has to be both hyperlocal and national. It has to be coordinated. Equality Florida is part of a network of state organizations that we get together under the banner called the Equality Federation. And we share every bit of information, everything that we see on the horizon, every piece of legislation that gets introduced in one place. You know, we sound the alarm for each other, and we share, you know, both the mistakes. Hey, listen, we tried this. Don't do that. It's a waste of time. And hey, this was the best thing we could have done. We wish we would have done that earlier. And so through the Equality Federation, state by state, we've put together some rapid response tools. But in terms of the resources, that Skye was talking about, these think tanks are well-funded, well-coordinated, and resourced to create these AstroTurf organizations, that are a lot of smoke and mirrors, but they end up casting a big shadow, much bigger than they actually are. So we have to invest in the actual grassroots work of getting parents to show up, real parents of kids in that school to show up at the school district level. And when we do that, we outnumber them by a wide margin because they don't have real grassroots buy-in. But they have been able to use their significant resources to make it appear so. And so we have to invest much more deeply in local organizing and much more deeply in coordinating so that the folks on the ground can share what we have learned and build strategies that can work all across the country.
Did I see another question in the audience? If not, I'll go to our virtual question. The virtual question comes in from one of our attendees. And the question is, one of the great features of the left is that it's a big tent. However, it is also Achilles' heels because it makes it harder to get agreement and focus on issues. Given that this moment in time needs the kind of focus, what needs to be done by philanthropy, academia, policy organization, community organizations to make that happen?
Sure, I'll take this one, and then to begin, I think this is a great question, and there's a lot of, you can always, it's funny because people are like, why can't we all focus on one or two issues? Well, you know, what I like to call the democracy side of history, or sort of this bend in the moral universe, you know, we care about lots of things and people, and there are real needs every day, and so I think that's one of the challenges. Some models that we've seen recently, because one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the 2016 election is I think there really was this acknowledgement that some programs and wonderful institutions that have been doing phenomenal work and continue to, but they're very siloed in their issue areas, and part of that is because of funding models. And so one thing that we've seen with sort of generalized funding models is that there's an ability to really work across lots of different issues and to then sort of and to coordinate. And so I'll give a few examples from some other contexts. So you saw throughout the country, there were these in school boards, in small, in communities, there was all of this fighting over masks. And it got, incredibly violent for people at times. Masks in schools, public health guidance. School boards got bullied for having public health guidance. Part of this, we know, was the toolkits that were sent out by sort of far-right organizations to try to drum some of this up. So there was no way at the time to sort of really figure out where it was going to sort of bubble up and how to get there from a national sort of legal perspective in every single place. But one thing that we were able to do was to look at, so who would have an interest in this broadly, right? So one group is the American Academy of Pediatrics. It sponsors that guidance. And so instead of an organization, sort of a more national organization trying to go to every local community, there was no way to figure out how to do that. Local communities were, parents wanted their kids to be safe. I mean, parents were starting that fight. And so one model we had was to file briefs throughout the country on behalf of an organization that then had local chapters that carried moral and academic authority in those places. And we really saw that, again, if you push up against the door, a lot of times when you think you won't succeed, we saw some good results in those cases, not in all of them, and a lot of people got hurt along the way. But I think that a lot of this has to do with really the coordination and thinking, how can national strategies support local ones and support local communities, and what are the best ways there? And then also we've seen bringing things from the public square into the academic square is also wonderful. There are phenomenal scholars that are doing a lot of this work, but there is a lack of coordination in sort of how you get it on the ground. And so I think sort of funding models and that can be more generalized, that can sort of understand this is like, we want to be strategic, and to be strategic, sometimes you can't be in sort of narrow focused things. I think we've seen that in the post-2016 era in some models has really been able to make an impact. So that's one thing I would say. You may have some other insights there.
Well, I mean, here's the reality. To the left, the right is really good at tying things together. Like, you find an anti-masker, you tend to find somebody that is an indicator of a sort of a raft of beliefs that are tied to, sort of their unifying theory. For me, you cannot fight racism, you can't fight anti-LGBTQ work, you can't do the work of securing our bodily autonomy when it comes to the decision if and when to be a parent, without addressing this attack on democracy. If there was, so to me, the ability of us, for each of us, to live our lives free of unnecessary interference, but with accountability, to provide for the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, all of these things flow from a certain set of ideals that are under attack right now. January 6th is the distillation of everything that is off kilter. We came damn close to watching our elected leaders executed and live streamed. Very, very close. And I think that there's a little bit of, I don't know, normalcy bias or cognitive dissonance where it's hard for us to grasp just how close we came to that. But if you go back in history, you see these moments. You know, Google the Battle for Liberty Place in New Orleans. Google, you know, Wilmington, North Carolina. It's not the first time that angry white self-styled militias have attacked a Capitol because they didn't like the outcome of an election. And we have to understand just how critical, if we lose this piece, as imperfect as it is, this hold on democracy as an avenue for change, then how we get there on all of these other issues becomes a closed door. And so I think that all of these issues are tied. We talk about intersectionality, but the people who organize against us, they understand intersectionality as well. They connect the dots to create a world in which they retain power, they circumscribe the liberties of other people, and you know, so I don't know that we have to be so self-conscious about the fact that we think everybody, immigrants, people born here, that we, you know, that everybody ought to have a chance at a good life in America. I don't think we should apologize for that or think of it as a very complicated math problem. But I do think in this moment, in the unique circumstance we find ourselves in right now, standing up for the possibility of democracy opening doors to make significant change in America has to be a priority.
And with that, our time is up. And as Ursula comes forward, I'm going to ask all of you to please join me in just a huge applaud for our speakers and thank them.
Thank you. Great job. Great job.